Well, hi everybody. So I've got the rather dubious task of trying to keep everybody on time because the timings are pretty tight, and it's not one of my strong suits, funnily enough. So I think what I'll do, people, is that I'll give you a sort of 2 or 3 minute warning, if that's okay, to say how long you've got, and we'll need to end and move on to the next speaker fairly pronto. Okay, so shall we go to our first speaker, who is going to talk, whose presentation is called Queer Minds, Queer Needs. And so this is going to be presented by Dr. Julian-Pascal Saadi. I can't see you on the, I've got the gallery. Oh, there you are. Hi. And Erene Hadjiioannou, something like that. And I can't see you on my screen. Oh, hi. So can I hand over to you both?
Yeah, of course. So Julian and I have decided to split our presentation 50-50, so I'll start. So I'm Erene Hadjiioannou, and happy to repeat that if needed because it's unusual. Very, very grateful for the definitions that we've just covered, because that actually saves me some time, so very much appreciated. So mine and Julian's paper, Queer Minds, Queer Needs, is primarily to assist psychotherapists and counsellors on acknowledging the social context in which we all coexist with each other, how that influences our mental health system, how that shapes how we might deliver therapeutic services as well. Within our paper, we sort of refer to queer as quite an expansive term, so acknowledging people that don't fall within the categories of cisgender, heterosexual or monogamous. Within our paper, we largely focus on talking about gender and sexuality, dissecting those ideas, thinking about the formation of queer identity within those lenses, but equally we believe that much of our concepts and their implications for practice could be applied to people that practice consensual non-monogamy. In writing this paper, we noted that in a world organised by binaries, I guess societally, the privilege that's given to people who are cisgender, heterosexual and monogamous also plays out within our mental health system. And if we live in a shared world with clients, we acknowledge that psychotherapy itself doesn't occur in a vacuum. So how do we all internalize this sense of prioritizing one type of identity over another, and therefore who's well, unwell, what do we pathologize or not? Our motivations for writing this paper is, got a couple of threads to this really. We were primarily motivated because we've just completed a diploma with an organisation called Pink Therapy on gender, sex and relationship diversity. And that really illuminated to us how much more we need to be doing in our practice as psychotherapists to fully welcome anybody that might approach us for mental health supports. We know that queer people do find it harder to access mainstream mental health services, and we also know that they can have poorer outcomes from accessing those services than non-queer counterparts, so it is a huge concern for us. Equally, we are in a slightly interesting position of being queer ourselves, although in different ways. We work with queer clients and we have also accessed mental health services ourselves as queer people. So we've really brought that lived experience and working experience to our paper. And in terms of the social context of I guess cis-normativity, heteronormativity, the way we prioritise and privilege people who are cisgender, people who are heterosexual, I should say. We know the world is organised within a very binary system, and we largely try to advocate for fluidity in psychotherapy to really expand our thinking and welcome all different types of clients into our practice. And again, knowing that psychotherapy doesn't exist in a vacuum means that it is one of many spaces that psychotherapists occupy. It's one of many spaces that our clients occupy. And what that means is we all navigate all those different spaces in the world and try to think about queerness together, is that there's a really live intersection of policy, law and healthcare for queer clients. One clear example at the moment is the very public and often aggressive discourse on transgender people, their rights, can they access healthcare? Is transgender even a thing? Is it okay? So we do really look at the notion of being transgender as an example to really expand upon the concepts we're trying to explore. And as I've mentioned, because we all live in this very cis-normative and heteronormative world, we start to lose sight of the fact that anybody, queer or non-queer, holds their identity in their own unique way, and it is a process that can evolve throughout one's lifetime. So for many queer people navigating this cis heteronormative world, their identity formation process is often navigated in private, or at least in parts. I think the internet has changed that slightly. There's so many more places that queer people can go to get an affirmative mirroring of who they are, see role models as well. We do touch on the fact that queer people being forced to provide these affirmative spaces for themselves are often places where they can become pathologized again. So one example that we briefly touch on is rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is the idea that young people are going online and being sold the idea that the cause of any distress they might be experiencing is to medically transition and change their gender. So that erases transgender as an identity in and of itself, and it basically perpetuates the idea that young people are simply misplacing their distress, so they're just mistaken. And obviously that's extremely problematic. And we also considered how binaries can exist and be perpetuated within multiple spaces, particularly for queer clients that hold intersectional identities. So for example, when religious affiliation intersects with queerness, we might find ourselves coming up against ideas of conversion therapy, the idea that there's something wrong with you, we need to fix this. So I'll pause for now and hand over to Julian, who will then speak a little bit more to how we use these ideas to actually really think about how do we apply this to practice to support queer clients.
Thanks, Erene. And yeah, just to echo, it's a real privilege to be here and to be speaking to all of you. I'm looking forward to the group work as well. So just to continue really from what Erene was saying, so in our paper specifically, we use the example of genders beyond the binary, and we have a little bit of a think about the fact that there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that the transgender community are one of the most neglected communities in terms of our mental health services and systems, and quite literally attacked, as Erene was saying. And that's partly, well, I say primarily, partly, because there is an assumption that gender reflects anatomy. And so then people whose genders don't fit that mold will get pathologized kind of automatically. So it would understandably create a cycle of mistrust, as we also see in the Black community, for example, and other other ethnicities as well that aren't white, essentially. And something that we talk about a little bit is the diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria as defined by the DSM. It sort of speaks to the other gender. And why is that problematic? It's not always problematic, but it can be, particularly because it reinforces the gender binary, the kind of the male-female split. And actually, a lot of trans people, as was kind of highlighted in that definition earlier, identify as something other than a kind of trans man or trans woman. It can be kind of genderqueer, non-binary. There are so many different kind of variations, essentially, of trans becoming that isn't quite captured by the gender dysphoria diagnosis. And there has been a kind of a shift we are seeing. So, for example, in the ICD-11, I think they've moved gender dysphoria from the category of mental health and put it under sexual health. So it's being seen completely differently. So there are kind of movements systemically. That does disadvantage some people. It's not a perfect fix, but it does something to try and depathologize in terms of mental health and locating transness as a mental phenomenon. So that's quite a significant shift. Something that we thought was quite interesting was, well, I say interesting, kind of, is the idea that there is an idea sometimes that transness is a response to trauma. And that if trauma gets resolved, then cisness gets revealed. And it's quite an interesting link, because I remember quite early in our pink therapy training, we were sort of, the point was raised that we don't really kind of locate sort of cisness as response to trauma. So interesting how, again, when it's not the norm, things automatically get questioned. And actually, even if there was a direct link between trauma and transness, couldn't it be post-traumatic growth? Why does it have to be something more negative and needing resolution, given that trauma does impact identity in every single way? So why not gender? So that's just something that we kind of thought about, and we thought was quite an interesting one. There hasn't been much discussion around it being a positive thing. So I just wanted to share that. So in terms of, so what does this all mean for psychotherapy? So I guess it's about what would psychotherapy look like if it was slightly more fluid. And it's primarily, certainly for me anyway, it's being primarily about kind of questioning the things that I think. The kind of token word is unlearning, but in a way it kind of is. It's sort of, and so it's kind of unlearning some of the belief systems that I've had around this topic, and resisting the kind of the tendency for binary thinking. And I think it's Kevin Dutton who's done some work on binary thinking and how it's quite a sort of an evolutionarily conserved thing that we do. So he kind of frames it more as a bias than anything else. And so if we kind of take that as some form of a truth, then what does it mean for the way that we understand binary genders or binary sexuality, so straight and gay, for example? So it's about kind of, yeah, it's sort of just fluidifying our definitions a little bit, and sort of understanding that queerness can exist in so many different forms. And there's even research now, I mean, there's terms that have come out like straight-ish or mostly straight, or I mean, there are so many variations of this, but they all point towards something very similar, which is that sexuality, for example, can exist on a spectrum. Actually, the categories that we have don't always actually speak to the lived experience. So it's kind of holding that in mind, I think. In terms of so I'm just conscious of the time, I think we've only got a few minutes left, but kind of implications for practice, which is the kind of the last sort of part of the paper. So our regulatory guidelines are saying that we need to be, non-judgmental, and that's pretty much across the board. I think most sort of bodies recognize the same sort of need for non-judgmental, being empathic, that kind of thing. But what we're sort of saying is that from an affirmative perspective, from the perspective that we're coming from, it's not always enough to be sometimes like an active unlearning process, a kind of a proactive walking towards the queer other as opposed to not. And also, an idea that I think about a lot is examining our own queerness. Is it possible that we're all kind of, I don't like to categorize in that way, but is it possible that queerness is something other than just sexually fluid? So kind of really thinking about what queer means. And I guess queer theory sort of speaks to that it's about subversion of multiple things, not just sexuality and gender. One thing that we sort of touch on as well is that we know that from identity development theories, particularly in relation to sexuality, is that queer people often have to conceal their identities in order to survive, whether that's physical survival or psychic survival. And that means that can play out in the therapy room as well. So it's often something that I hear is, well, if my client doesn't bring the topic of sexuality, why would I bring it up? That feels like I'm imposing something onto the client. And whilst I understand that, I think it's a perspective that arguably ignores the kind of the power differences and how people who have been taught to conceal their identities don't necessarily bring that part of themselves. So it's just kind of thinking about that. And then what does that mean for the way that we practice within the frameworks that we're using in therapy, whether it's CBT or person-centered or psychoanalysis or whatever? just kind of how do we then embed that within our frameworks to understand what we might need to change in our practice. So to round it all off, essentially, we're really just encouraging everyone to think about their understandings of queerness and what could it mean to practice in a more fluid relation to our queer clients. We're in a really good position as there's to offset disempowerment. And in my mind, I think it's a key part of our role, or certainly my role anyway, that's how I like to think about it. And it's really, yeah, I often ask myself, what kind of sexualities and genders are available to me, to inhabit, to embody? And I kind of like that question because it means that there's possibilities, and it's
you just have 1 minute.
Yeah, sorry.
You just have 1 minute.
Yeah, thank you. That was it. I'm done. But thank you for warning me. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, both of you. I was just kind of struck between something that you were both talking about, something that Dale said, and which was the kind of this idea of fluidity, and not pinning things down, but how difficult it is to be clear about anything in the middle of that, which I certainly find. So thank you very much, and I guess we go over to questions. We just have 5 minutes for questions or comments or whatever.
Just want to sort of follow something you said, Julia, just now about fluidity and clarity, because I think that the whole thing about being clear about where we are with sexuality is probably a problem, because I think, you know, sexuality is too complicated for us to be clear about in any of it in some ways. That's my thought anyway.
Yeah.
Go on. Yeah.
Well, somebody else wants to speak. I was, thank you very much. So much there. I think, you know, if we cancel all the other speakers and groups and just stay with yours, I think today. There's so much. Thank you. I mean, there's too much for me in the sense that when you talk about fluidity, I found myself not realizing, but inappropriately hoping that the client who's trying to work something out around this area will have the same orientation as me. And of course, I noticed that even more with other people, you know? And so I'm interested in your thoughts with regard to, I don't know if you agree with developmental models, you know? But there seems to be such a problem, such a high risk problem that, and I think of it more with young people, but not necessarily, you know, that they're working something through. And I feel people of whatever their orientation so often encourage them in that orientation, whereas they might be past, you know, moving to, it's fluid, you know, moving to something else. And the danger is as psychotherapists, we fix them in wherever we're coming from. I don't know if you agree with that or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can respond to that briefly. We do touch on the fact that developmental models absolutely have a value, and also that they can be limited in a way because there is a sense of, well, we all start here and we all end up here, and that's kind of that. And of course, even within a family culture, there's explicit and implicit sort of messaging, whatever it might be, around how you're supposed to be. So within our paper, we do actually denote that for many queer people, they may be at risk of developing a false self, which then further perpetuates that sense of I'm not right, or I have to be a different way, and also further potentially having them navigate their sense of self and identity as a very private process. Yeah, it's interesting because it sounds like part of what's coming up from our conversation so far today is a little bit of like a fear of not having a fixed position. So actually, how do we become more comfortable with fluidity? And yeah, even just acknowledging that, yeah, because our identity has the potential to evolve throughout our lifetime, that actually that is part of something that's healthy for both queer and non-queer people alike. It's just meeting someone where they're at, which I think for me anyway speaks so much to the therapeutic process. You meet someone at a particular point in their life, in their process. If you do short-term work, for example, you meet them where they're at that particular time. And yeah, so I'll pause for now because it looks like there's more people joining in.
Julia, first, you've got the hand up.
Ask a question.
We've just got time for one question.
Okay. The last few days, or even about a week, I've been looking at Wilhelm Reich, sort of orgon energy and all that kind of stuff. But some of his earlier writing is about body armor. And I'm just wondering, with all these labels that we keep producing, they seem to be never ending. How much of that and all these definitions is us trying to create some kind of body armor around our sexuality, rather than just allowing the fluidity that we've been talking about? So we seem to be doing one thing, but speaking another. Just some thoughts on that, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and I guess it makes me think of, when I think of that in relation to heteronormativity and power relations and the need for a label in order to exist, I think I hold a stand position with it, because I think in my mind anyway, there's a need for an identity label to resist oppressive forces, but equally, I think there is a potential for fracturing of communities with that. But it's, I don't know, for me, it feels like a tension. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to have to stop you, I'm afraid. Sorry, I'm going to have to stop you there because we need to move on to the other speaker. Thank you for that. I think that was a very difficult question, and I can immediately feel the tension in myself from it. So I think it raises something important, actually. So thank you all for that. We now need to move on to our next speaker.